Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Heritage Ohio's virtual conference. I want to thank Sandvik Architects, who is our title sponsor for the conference. I want to thank Schooley Caldwell, who are the day sponsors for today, Monday, August 31st, and the State Historic Preservation Office for being the sponsor of our AIA continuing education credits. For those of you who want HSW 1.5 credits, you'll see the learning objectives are in the chat box. And if you want those credits, you need to email our office manager, Devin Miles. So email officemanager@heritageohio.org and include your AIA membership number so he can get you registered for those credits. Today, I'm delighted to have Schooley Caldwell join us for a session about ADA accessibility. I have Rachel Eifert, who is a designer at Schooley Caldwell and has worked on a variety of renovation and new construction projects. Rachel earned her bachelor's and master's degree of architecture from OSU. She's worked on a variety of multifamily housing projects and urban infill developments. Also with us is Melinda Shaw, who is Vice President of Schooley Caldwell and an architect specializing in historic preservation and renovation design from a variety of uses, from civic, culture, commercial to government projects and multifamily. Melinda received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Cincinnati and her certificate in historic preservation. And I'm ready to share the screen.
Hopefully.
Okay, everyone. As Joyce mentioned, my name is Rachel Eifert and I'm with Schooley Caldwell, and we're going to talk about accessibility and multifamily housing.
Go ahead.
Okay, there we go. All righty. So as a young designer, the concept of integrating accessibility requirements into projects is the norm, but it hasn't always been. Since the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1991, the way buildings, including historic ones, can serve all users has shifted. With a growing number of historic buildings being adapted for housing, it is important to understand what the requirements are for accessibility so they can be incorporated into renovation projects to create not only code compliant, but functional spaces for everyone. I'm going to talk about the history and the evolution of accessibility requirements and identify and evaluate common accessibility issues that typically occur and determine when an elevator is required. And then Melinda's going to come in and discuss the differences between accessible type A, type B, and type C apartment units. Why accessibility matters. So we're going to look at this little snapshot of Ohio. 25.6% of adults in the US have some kind of disability. In Ohio, it's 26.9%. Looking at the different disabilities, we have mobility, which is difficulty walking or climbing stairs. Cognition, which is serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. Independent living, so you would have issues doing errands alone, such as visiting a doctor's office or shopping. Hearing, vision, having difficulty seeing even with glasses. And self-care, having trouble dressing yourself or bathing.
And it's important to remember too that, we often think of the people that have long-term disabilities. There are lots of us that over our course of our lifetime, you might break an ankle, be on crutches for a few weeks. Maybe it's not so much a mobility thing, but you have a stroller or carts or things. So these accessibility issues really do impact everyone.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look and at sort of like the history and how we've evolved to all the requirements that we have today. And starting with the Fair Housing Act, it was kind of an extension of the 1964 Civil Rights Act into the housing market. It outlawed the refusal to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of race, color, disability, religion, sex, familial status, or national origin. It also protects against discrimination of the specific types of real estate activity, like aspects of the sale, rental, and financing of dwellings. Fair Housing Act is federally regulated. It is intended for multiple family housing of 4 units or more. It is enforced through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in 1988, the Fair Housing Amendment Act extends discrimination protections for individuals with disabilities and provides individuals the ability to challenge local zoning laws. Next is the Americans with Disability Act, ADA. It was enacted in 1991 and addresses things not in the Fair Housing Act. It prevented discrimination against people with disabilities on all fronts, including employment, state, local government, public accommodations, telecommunications, and several other areas. It is federally regulated and enforcement is through HUD. And architects must comply to the ADA's provisions when designing the facilities covered by it. So we're talking about public spaces, of lodging, establishments serving food or drink, places of exhibition or entertainment, places of public gathering, sales or rental establishments, service establishments, stations used for specified public transportation, places of public display or collection, places of recreation, places of education, social services, center establishments, and places of exercise or recreation. Okay, now we're going to look at the International Building Code, which is a model code each state adopts and is able to make modifications to or amendments. Alongside with the International Building Code, we use ANSI, the ICCA 117.1 as a companion document. So you would look into the state of Ohio adapts the International Building Code into its own, and there you will see it defines if you need something or not in your building. And then you would look for into the ANSI to see what are the specific requirements in terms of like width or height and stuff like that. And when looking at these, be sure to use the right edition and include all state amendments to obtain the most current state code. The enforcement is through the local building official. And in Ohio, the building code addresses accessibility in Chapter 11. Also, the International Building Code is updated every 3 years. So after reviewing Fair Housing Act and ADA and the International Building Code, it's important to realize when you look at buildings, there are multiple regulations that can apply within the same building. For example, lobbies or leasing offices in a multifamily apartment building are covered by the local building code. They are public accommodations since the public is coming to see if they might want to lease an apartment. So they're covered by the ADA, and they're covered by the Fair Housing Act because it's an amenity that supports the multifamily housing in the building. Dwelling units are not public and are not covered by the ADA. They're covered by local code and they're covered by the Fair Housing Act. Here's just a further slide showing you in a multifamily, maybe have mixed use, which regulations cover which occupancy of the space. So yes, accessible clearances require more space with cost up front, but it's likely that it's less costly to account for accessibility requirements early in the design process rather than missing them and having to fix them in the field change or getting sued after the building is complete. Accessible routes, we're going to go into what it means to have an accessible route. But first, we need to remember that it's important that we're not just designing for people in wheelchairs, we're also designing for people who may have crutches or a walker or a service animal. So when we look at designing for a site, we want to take into consideration access to public transit and sidewalk. Also apartment amenities such as mailboxes and play areas, and making an accessible route to the ground level of the building. So here you can see we've got mailboxes, accessible, transit, and a playground, and curbs. Also, to extend this further, we want to make sure we have parking aisles, passenger drop-off areas, curbs, ramps, and all have accessible route to the leasing office if there is one. Here we're looking at what an accessible route looks on the inside. So we have doors without doorways. We've got turning spaces. We've got rules for, protrudements and what they need to be. Next is the clear width of doorways. Clear opening width of doorways, regardless of function, shall be measured 32 inches minimum between the face of the door stop with the door open 90 degrees. A minimum of 36-inch width is required at doorways with a depth greater than 24 inches.
So the important thing to remember here too is if you have to have 32-inch minimum clear, that does not mean a 32-inch door. It is a door that has that clear is generally always much larger than that because the door is taking up part of that clear space. So that you're looking closer to a 36-inch door at that point.
So along with that, maneuvering clearances at doors, these really depend on the big arrow is the individual's direction of travel, and clearances on doorways depend on if you're on a push approach or a pull approach, and as well as whether you're approaching from the hinge or the latch as well. Also to take into consideration are reaches and clearances. These would be for things such as light switches, outlets, outlets above countertops, and also windows. You need to remember how you open your windows. Is the unlatching clear up at the top of the window? That's something you need to keep in mind as well. Elevators, when are they required and how big? So if you listened to Tim's presentation earlier, the answer to that question is it depends. So in this case, the answer is yes if the building has more than 4 dwelling units and each floor is greater than 3,000 square feet. And the answer is no if the building has less than 4 dwelling units, is less than 3,000 square feet, and there are units on the accessible level, and is R1 use and contains no more than 5 sleeping units. You might be asking what's R1 use. R1 occupancies contain sleeping units where the occupants are primarily transient in nature. This includes things like hotels, boarding houses, and congregate living facilities. Okay, so say you need an elevator. You must provide an accessible route to all units unless the floor is less than 3,000 square feet and at least one floor is accessible. For buildings that are between 2 and 4 stories above grade, an accessible route can be provided by specially designed stairs, ramps, or an elevator. In most cases, if the building is 4 or more stories above grade, then it will require an elevator for accessibility. So we take a look at this diagram, and on the left side, we have flats, and on the right side, we have townhomes. Each floor of the flat is serviced by an elevator, which means it's covered. And on the right, since we have 2-story units or townhomes, only the ground floor, the primary entrance into that townhome is covered. Okay, so typical elevators, they must be classified as a passenger elevator and comply with American Society of Mechanical Engineers, A 17.1 and CSA B44. This is for stories 3 stories or less above grade. And here you can see the different size requirements, and a lot of the times it deals with which side of, how your doors open. Is it to the side or is it centered? And as well as things like buttons and button locations and making sure they are risen and at the appropriate heights. And a lot of times there are a lot of exceptions for elevators in existing buildings. So be sure to look those up and make sure.
It's also important, work with your elevator manufacturer early, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, is that a 2,500-pound elevator? Is it a 3,500-pound elevator? And the answer is it depends on the elevator manufacturer, because they all require slightly different shaft sizes and all the cabs are slightly different sizes, even if it's the same class of elevator. So make sure that when you are in your planning project that you account for that.
Okay, so now if you're in a building that's 4 or more stories above or below grade, an elevator that accommodates an ambulance stretcher must be provided. So here you're seeing a diagram of how stretchers are maneuvered within the cab, and a stretcher is 24 by 84 inches with a 5-inch radius corner in it. So, and this, along with that is, there is an international symbol for emergency medical services, Star of Life. The symbol shall not be less than 3 inches in height and shall be placed on both sides of the hoist wave door of the frame. So my little image here, when the next time you go on an elevator, if it accommodates a stretcher, you should see this symbol. Okay, case study. This is a project where we didn't need an elevator. This is an apartment building. It's kind of in 3 different chunks. You can see there's 2 buildings up front and then 1 long bar building in the back. The occupancy group here is an R3, which means people, the residents are permanent in nature, but the exits are independent and they exit onto the outside. So on the ground floor, the long bar building in the back happens to be our units on an accessible route. There's only 5 units here, and this portion of it is less than 3,000 square feet. So we did not need an elevator in this building, and this is really common. You see these buildings all the time, all over Ohio, and there are some other exceptions to this as well. This being listed here, at least 1 level must be accessible and provided with accessibility type A, type B units. Multi-story units, townhomes without an elevator is not required to require type B units. Elevator service is present, but only reaches the lowest story of the units. Site and practicality, where multiple non-elevator buildings number type B units can be reduced, and design flood elevation as well. So I'm going to let Melinda take this over and discuss different unit types.
Thanks, Rachel. So unit types are a little confusing, especially if you're looking at, so you have your typical Main Street building that used to have apartments upstairs, and it's like, great, let's go back to that. This is a great thing for downtown Main Streets, have residential on the upper floors. Now things aren't just, okay, well, we designed an apartment. There are all sorts of different apartments, and remember when Rachel's talked about, there's ADA requirements, there's OBC requirements, the Ohio Building Code, there's ANSI requirements, there's fair housing requirements. What kind of details what type of units there are is the ANSI requirements, the A117.1. And the important thing to keep in mind, we're going to go through each one of these, is ANSI A117.1. Currently, the current version in Ohio is 2009. There is already a 2017 version out there that has not been adopted by Ohio yet, but quite a few of these clearances are going to be changing and getting larger. So just keep that in mind if you have a project out there that's, you're starting preliminary design for it, but it might not be built for a few years, you may want to go ahead and start planning for those larger clearances. So for our unit types, there are generally 4 classifications of units. There's a type C, which currently the Ohio Building Code doesn't even require. There's a type B that has a lot of things accessible, but not everything. Type A, which is kind of defined as an adaptable unit where it has all the clearances, but you may have to go in and make a few adjustments to make it fully accessible. And then you also have your fully accessible units. Those are the ones that are ready for someone to move in and, you know, later today. So go to the next slide. So we're going to start with going least restrictive to most restrictive, or least prescribed, shall we say. So type C, these are considered visitable units. They're not required by the OBC or the International Building Code yet. They have started introducing this type so that it provides a model for accessibility that can be adapted to new housing that isn't impacted by the Fair Housing Act. And the intent of these is really to let people that may have a disability visit the unit. So you'll see the features are more focused on being able to just come into the main spaces versus everything in the unit being accessible. So, and this doors, it's a minimum of 31 3/4 inches clear. So again, that doesn't mean you can do a 32-inch door. You have to go through and double check, you know, with your hinges and your door stops and your hardware to make sure you get the 32 inches clear. And that's on all doors in the unit. So, and then the kitchen, if it is a pass-through kitchen, it can be, the cabinets need to be a minimum of 40 inches wide. And the same thing if it's a type C, if it's visitable, it's 40 inches. And one other thing, please keep in mind, all these dimensions, or at least nearly all of them, are minimum code requirements. You can always go above and beyond, and that's where you start talking about universal design and things. So these really truly are bare minimum requirements. So, and for those units, it's also washer and dryer. There's no requirements because usually if you're having people over, they're not doing your laundry. So bathrooms, you need a bathroom on the primary entrance level. This bathroom has to have the same clearances as a type B unit, which we'll be going over soon. You do not have to have a shower in that particular bathroom. So this might be a half bath and that satisfies this. Again, and remembering that these are visitable units. So you may be, someone's having a dinner party and one of their guests has mobility improvements. They can use the bathroom. It may not have all the grab bars, it may not have a shower, but at least there is a bathroom that they can use. So type B, again, and also for type C, there's no bedroom requirements for it because the intent is you're just visiting. So type B units, getting a little more prescriptive of these. So these meet the Fair Housing Act guidelines. So these meet FHA. They're considered convertible units, which means with a little work, they can become an accessible unit. If you're doing, so when we say group R or group I, these are talking what use group it is per the building code. So I is institutional, so hospitals, things like that. Group R are all your different types of residential uses, whether from hotels, motels, apartments, dormitories, monasteries, all those types of things. In R and I, there are subcategories as well. So for both I and R, everything that is not required to be an accessible unit or a type A unit is required to be built as a type B unit. And there is a few exceptions to that that we'll get into later. So for these then, the entry door, the primary entrance, should be 36 inches wide. This will get you more than 32 inches clear. If you also think about it, if you're designing units, having your primary entrance 36 inches wide isn't just an accessibility thing. Practically speaking, if you're moving furniture in, unless all of it comes flat packed from IKEA, this is a very handy feature to have. And this is not uncommon in most units, is your primary entrance is has a 36-inch wide door leaf. It just makes moving things in and out easier. Now, within the unit, other doors can go back to that 32 inches minimum clear. Okay. So the kitchens, if you remember on type C, it was 40 inches minimum clear for both pass through, like a galley kitchen, and a U-shaped kitchen. On type B units, you can still have a 40-inch clear if it's a pass through, because the thought is that someone doesn't have to turn around in the kitchen. They can go through the kitchen at the other end, turn around, and then come back. So that works for a pass through. On a U-shaped kitchen though, once you're in, you have to be able to turn around within the kitchen. So it's now a 60-inch minimum clearance within a U-shaped kitchen. So washers and dryers, again, now you're starting to talk about people that might be living in the unit, so them being able to access everything. So you start needing a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space, and that's kind of the typical clear floor space dimensions for a wheelchair. Now, that's one of the clearances that's going to be increasing in the new version of the code. So for these, you can actually do stacked washer dryer units. There's a maximum that you can have the controls from the floor, but they can be stacked. You just need to really make sure not all stacked units will work. So, okay. Bathrooms in type B units start getting into the fun design. Now, Rachel and I actually work with another young woman who loves designing bathrooms with all these clearances because she sees it as a fun puzzle. And they are a bit of a challenge because every part of the bathroom pretty much has its own clearance requirements, from the toilet to the sink to the shower or the bathtub. There have to be room for grab bars. There has to be, toilet paper has to be used in a certain place. And by no means am I going to go through all these clearances because most of the time you have to look them up. There's clearances for nearly everything. Now, in a type B unit, you don't necessarily have to have the grab bars and all of that, but you have to plan ahead and include blocking in your wall, which basically means, for those of you who aren't architects, behind your plaster, your gypboard wall, you have plywood or other stronger materials behind that finish. Because if you've ever installed a curtain rod or even just a toilet paper holder and all you're anchoring it to is drywall, that is not strong enough to hold up someone that's using a grab bar. So you have to plan ahead so that these units, remember, these are adaptable units. They can be changed later. So someone could come in and install a grab bar without having to completely rebuild the wall. So, but a few basic clearances is having a 30 by 48 clear space beyond the door swing. So that way someone has maneuvering space where they're not going to get hit by the door. The toilet needs a 48 by 56 clearance. The sink has a 33-inch clearance. Now that clearance can actually overlap with the toilet clearance. So some of these clearances can overlap, like the shower can also overlap with the sink or the toilet, but other clearances, like the clearance for the door, cannot. So it's just you have to go through and very carefully look at every clearance in a bathroom to make sure they're all working out. So you often see in this diagram, it's showing boxes dashed in on the floor, like there's one for the toilet, there's one for the sink, there's one for the door, there's one for the bathtub. So you can check and make sure you have all those clearances. You'll often see architects dashing those in, and owners will look at them and go, why, what are all those dashed lines? And it's architects doing their due diligence, trying to make sure everything fits the way it looks to. This is the same reason that, you know, if you've seen typical house built in the 70s or 80s, you have your 5-foot by 8-foot bathroom. You have your bathtub at the end, the toilet next to it, the vanity, and then your door. It all fits, it's great. You cannot build a 5-foot by 8-foot bathroom that meets the requirements of a type B, type A, or accessible unit anymore. They just aren't big enough. So after that, type A, this is getting to be the ones that really are meant to be very easily adapted. You don't really have to renovate them. It's fairly quick and easy changes. So the other thing is, every space in it starts to be needing to be accessible. So all rooms have to have either the 5-foot circle turning radius somewhere in the room or a T-shaped turning radius. These are another thing. We've been so used to this, the 60-inch circle we've been using for years. This is getting bigger in a few years. So beware. That's going to be a big change for everybody. Doors, all doors need to be 36-inch wide, and they all have to have clearances around them. These clearances that Rachel showed you before, they take up a little more space than what you might be used to. So it makes corridors a little bit wider and things like that, because you have to have the maneuvering space so someone can actually pull up to a door, open it without hitting themselves, or have space to get into the room. So kitchens, so they have to meet all the same requirements that the type B did, plus at least 30 inches of work surface needs to be at a 34-inch height. So standard kitchen counters are at 36. You don't have to make all of the countertop at 34-inch in a type A, but you do have to have part of it at 34. The other thing you need to keep in mind is at the sink, you need to be able to have a front rather than a side approach to the sink. So meaning someone needs to be able to roll under the sink. The easiest way to do that and still make this unit leasable to everyone else is to have a kitchen cabinet where the front pulls out. You're allowed to do that if, and this is important to keep in mind when you're planning these, you have to keep the flooring continuous, so it goes all the way under this kitchen cabinet, and the wall surface continues all the way through it. So again, these are meant to be a quick, easy changes. So say like in a day, maybe 2 days prior to someone leasing this space, the leasing office could go in, they can remove this counter, they can maybe install a grab bar, and you're good to go. These are not major renovations. So having to like pull out a cabinet and install a floor would be considered not compliant. So washers and dryers, in these type A units, they need to be non-stacked washers and dryers. This makes the usability a little easier. You also need to pay attention. The floor space to access the washer and dryer can overlap, but you need to be careful if you're putting doors, if you're putting the washer and dryer in not a cabinet, but in a closet. You need to watch out for the doors. You also need to be careful when you are going out and purchasing the actual washers and dryers that all the controls are within the reach clearances that Rachel showed earlier. So bathrooms are getting even more fun. So grab bars in a type A unit need to be installed in at least one bathroom. They don't have to be installed everywhere, though you should put blocking in everywhere so you don't have to tear apart the wall again. But you have to have them installed in at least one bathroom. The toilet also needs more clear space. This is 60 by 56-inch area around it. So this is getting more towards what you would see in a commercial accessible bathroom. So like if you're going to a movie theater or a restaurant and you see that really big stall at the end, that you're going, gee, why is that one so big? It's starting to look at those clearances, but it helps when you think, again, remember, these aren't just for people in wheelchairs. I know I have 2 young kids, and as long as no one else is waiting for that, you have 2 young kids, that bathroom, that large stall is a bonus. It's much easier to take them to the bathroom. If you have crutches or other things, having that extra space can really make someone else's life easier. So in these, also for the sink, that can also still overlap the clearances required for the toilet. But if you want to put in a cabinet, a vanity cabinet under your sink, again, this has to be removable with the floor surface and the wall surface extending beyond or under, so under the cabinet, under the counter. So that way, all you have to do is pull out that cabinet and you're not having to damage anything. Now you could have a vanity built in on either side of the sink and that doesn't get removed, but you have to have your minimum clearance for your sink that someone can pull under the sink. So then the last type is accessible, fully accessible units. So generally these are for designed so someone could move in immediately. every space, again, has to have this 60-inch turning radius within all rooms. So doors, again, making sure that you have those wider doors and you have all the clearance space so you can actually get up to and operate that door. So kitchens, the work surface needs to be 28 to 34 inches high everywhere, which means going to a 34-inch tall cabinet or countertop, which is a slightly lower cabinet. Most cabinet manufacturers do make these ADA compliant cabinets that are 2 inches lower than everywhere else. The bigger challenge that we've run across in doing these accessible kitchens is trying to find a cooktop, because if you're doing a freestanding range, it is designed to fit into a countertop that is 36 inches tall. So more than likely, you're going to have to go to a cooktop with a separate oven. There are occasionally you can find ranges out there that are 34 inches tall, but they're kind of few and far between. So it's another thing just to make sure you're really paying attention to what is being specified and what is being purchased. Washers and dryers, again, in these units need to not be stacked. They can be front loading or top loading, but you do have to watch where the controls are and where the doors are. So in the bathrooms, grab bars, again, need to be installed in at least one of the bathrooms, and not just in the half bath. You have to have a shower or a bathtub that has grab bars too. In Ohio, this means for toilets, it's not just the 2 horizontal grab bars on either side of the toilet, well, kind of an L-shaped configuration, but you also need that additional vertical grab bar, which is another thing you need to make sure that you're putting blocking in for, because that's relatively speaking a newer thing that has come to Ohio, and you're likely to see it continue. And if you think about it, that vertical grab bar really can provide you with that extra leverage that makes it getting up easier. Making sure your toilet paper dispenser is located in the right place. And toilet paper dispensers are one of those things. I was looking this up yesterday, and depending on if you're looking at ANSI or FHA or there was another code, they all show them in slightly different places. So just really making sure that you're putting it where it's supposed to be so you don't have to move it later. That's the important thing with all of these, is doing your upfront research, making sure you're very specific about where things are, because it's not that you can't move them later, it just costs more. So sinks, oops, go back one. Sorry, Rachel. It's okay. Showers in these accessible units, they start taking up more space. They also must have a permanent seat. Now, this could be a seat that flips down or flips up, but it has to have a seat installed. It's not good enough just to, you know, pick one up, a portable seat up from Walgreens and plop it in there. It has to have one that's permanently mounted, so it's not going to move around. The other thing to watch with showers is you'll see the 36 by 36 inch shower, which is the smallest one. It's the rectangular one, where you have the seat versus where you have the controls. And this, even for the rectangular showers, really comes into play, is you really have to make sure where your grab bars are relative to your seat and relative to where the controls, like where you turn the shower on and off, all have very specific relations to each other and to where the clearance is outside the shower is. So bedrooms, accessible accessible units also have a clearance requirement for a bedroom. This means this assumes a queen size bed, and that you can have a minimum of 30 inches around all 3 sides of the bed. So this, again, just kind of summary, so you can see a little bit about how these vary from one type of unit to another. It's a lot of dimensions. They generally, the dimensions and the requirements generally get larger. The clearances get larger as you go from a type C, which is not too restrictive, to an accessible unit that just has a lot more, and it's not restrictive, it just has a lot more dimensions that you need to double check and make sure you're meeting all the requirements for. So all that said, you know, there's 4 different types of units. How do you know what you need? ANSI A117 does not define what type of units you need and how many you require. It just defines what those units are. So it'll tell you, like, okay, type A needs this height counter, this clearance for the toilet, this clearance for the sink, but it doesn't tell you you need 4 of them. It's the Ohio Building Code or the International Building Code in Ohio Building, it's section 1107 defines what type of units you need. So again, it's going back and forth between multiple code books. So if you're doing an R1, which is transient lodging, this is how many you need. So, and keep in mind, transient lodging, these are, think hotel. These are people, if it's coming in, you're not going to have time to go and take out cabinets or go install grab bars. These are things that need to be ready to go and accessible now. So if you have 1 to 25 units, or say hotel rooms, you need to have 1 unit that's accessible. If it's 26 to 50, you need 2 units. 51 to 75, there's 4 units. If it's 76 to 100 units, it's 5 accessible units. And then all other units within that building need to be a type B building or a type B unit. And if you need more than 1 accessible unit, it needs to be those different units. Say you had, if it was a hotel and you have rooms that have 2 queens and you also have rooms that have 1 king, and you have those 2 different styles of units, you should have 1 accessible unit that's a queen, has the 2 queens, and 1 accessible unit that has the 2 kings. So you're dispersing the accessible units across your unit types or your styles of units. So R2, these are more the apartments, the dormitories, things like that. If you have 20 or more units, you need at least 2% or a minimum of 1 to be a type A. Now, because these are less transient in nature, they're apartments or dormitories, you'll notice accessible units aren't required, but you do have to have a type A. So the thought is that if someone is going to lease this unit, you have, probably a week, maybe less, to go in. You can pull out those cabinets because that's very minor renovation, and you have yourself an accessible unit. Above that 2%, all the other units should be a type B unit. And again, same thing, these units should be dispersed across the various classes of units. So if you need, if you have studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms, and you need more than 1 accessible or more than 1 type A unit, they shouldn't all be just 1 bedrooms. There should be 1 that's a studio, maybe 1 that's a 1 bedroom, and maybe 1 that's a 2 bedroom, but they need to be dispersed. So that way it's equitable. Exceptions. So there's always exceptions in the code. There's lots and lots of exceptions in the code, really. If there is no elevator service, such as one of the buildings Rachel showed earlier, which that 3-story building that's less than 3,000 square feet, the type A units are on the ground floor because that's an accessible floor. The units above that do not need to be a type A or a type B, which also means, keep in mind, your type A units cannot go on an upper floor if it does not have an accessible route to it. It completely defeats the purpose of it. So, and then if it's an existing building, you start getting into chapter 34, which is our favorite existing building chapter in the Ohio Building Code, and the same thing in the International Building Code. Type B units are not required, even if there's a change in occupancy. So if you're converting that old school to apartments, you don't need to build the units as type B units if you're renovating less than or altering less than 50% of the building. As soon as you're altering more than 50%, you have to make them type B units. If the building is completely being changed use type, such as if you're going from a school and converting it to apartments, then everything must be, all your unit types must comply with 1107, which is the one that determines if you need type A or type B. Again, if you're renovating in an old apartment building and going through and kind of renovating units, it only applies to the units that are being added or altered if it's more than 50%. So at the same time, there is something in the building code that basically says you can't get around ANSI ADA accessibility laws by doing, 20% of the renovation this year, 20% of the renovation next year, but never doing more than 50%. It doesn't work that way. They caught on to that one a while ago. So if you are eventually intending to renovate the whole thing, you need to comply with the full regulations of renovating the entire building. So here's a case study from another building that we're working on. This is actually a new construction, but it's an infill project. So these are all R2 apartments. So meaning it's basically an apartment building, and it has, I forget how many units this one has, but at least there's more than 20. So at least 2% of them must be type A. So in this one, that meant we ended up needing one type A unit, but we went ahead and built 3. Sometimes that's done just because if you're designing a multi-story apartment building, it's much easier if the apartments are all aligned and stacked. So the apartment layout on one floor is identical to the one right above it. So we built in some extra ones, which is always a good thing. So. Occupancy changes. So we've also worked on a couple buildings where they say, okay, we're going to design it as apartments. And then, oh, by the way, because the market's changing a little bit, Airbnb is so hot, we're going to rent some of them out as Airbnb units or really make it into a regular hotel. Well, be warned, when you do that, you're changing it from an R2, which is apartments, to an R1. R1 because again, that's the ones that have to be immediately accessible because they're transient in nature. You don't know who might be there from one day to another, which means there are some of those R1s that have to be built as fully accessible right away. So we ended up having to build in some of those units or change them. I think it was already under construction when they said that, to being fully accessible units. Another case study. This is in an old brewery. And this is one where we're designing these, and we're have really high floor-to-floor height. So we're putting in lofts, keeping them away from the windows in case Mary Angela is listening in. And so the back half of it is lofted, but only the elevator in this building only connects to the main entrance of each of these apartments. So the second level of them does not have elevator access. So the question is, does the bathroom on the upper floor need to be built as a type B bathroom? And the answer is no, because there is not an accessible route to that bathroom. Now, to deal with that though, we did end up building in, because you have to have one bathroom that's accessible, we have a half bath on the first floor that is designed with type B clearances in mind. And the kitchen, which is also on the main level, will have all its type B clearances as well. So another chapter 34. This is an old house that had been broken up to an apartment. So it was already apartments, but it doesn't have an elevator. So, and it's not a change in use. It's a fairly small building. So these did not have to be a type A or a type B unit because it's fairly small and it's not a change of use. So, a few resources. So Rachel and I both mentioned a lot of things about the Fair Housing Act. So there's a link for that. There's ADA, which again, remember, that doesn't apply to the actual apartments, but it does apply to the common spaces. The current version of that is 2010. ANSI 8117.1, again, the current version being enforced in Ohio is 2009. And that's actually it's because ANSI, you have to purchase all their standards. That's the link for their store. I will say, if you Google that, you can find PDFs of it out there that are not for purchase. I didn't put it up there though. So you might also look, because there are, the 2017 is also out there. I'm not sure when Ohio will adopt it. We're probably, it's almost time for Ohio to adopt a new code. So the question is, will the new international building code adopt it in time for the Ohio building code to adopt it? Just not sure yet. So, and there's a link for the Ohio building code, which is the 2017 version, and that there are lots of free viewers up there for it. So, which is handy now that we're all working from home and don't have our giant code manuals, which are all stuck at the office because no one wants to carry them home. So, and with that, we have time for questions.
Okay, great. Please type in the question box and I'll read them to Melinda and Rachel. I know for a fact, if you could reiterate, I've got a lot of Main Street managers who are constantly hitting the elevator wall with your typical downtown 2- and 3-story building. Do you want to encapsulate that argument one more time for them?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason we wanted to talk about that. And that's one of the ones where it depends on how many units you have. The less unit, so if it's less than 4 units, you don't have to. If it's more than 4 units, you need to make some of them accessible. If you can make some that are on the first floor, which is kind of unusual, but these things do happen. If you have some that are on the first floor that are accessible, that are part of the bigger unit or part of the bigger complex, then you wouldn't necessarily have to have elevator access to the other floors, providing they're less than 3,000 square feet. We're working on the Newark Arcade right now, which I know a lot of people that are at this conference hopefully got to tour last year. And it's kind of quirky too, in that it had always had apartments on the upper floors. But the weird thing is it has upper floors at the east end, upper floors at the west end, and upper floors at the south end, none of which are connected to each other. So in that case, it's not a change of use because they have always been apartments, though I don't think anyone has occupied them for at least 40 years. Especially there's still medicine bottles in some of the cabinets and there's no way I would touch them. But we're making one end accessible with an elevator so we can get our accessible units in that end. But that way it precludes us from having to put in 3 elevators to the building.
Yeah, okay, here we have a question. What is your experience with Chapter 34 in the OBC, in particular Section 3411, accessibility for existing buildings, building Section 3411.7.1, disproportionate cost and alternative compliance?
Honestly, we have never tried to get out of putting an elevator in that way. That's part of, we usually, as our firm tries to go above and beyond and do what we can to make everything accessible. We actually wrote a book about accessibility before ADA even came out. It may be possible, but it's hard because I fully understand and appreciate these Main Street buildings. Getting those upper floors occupied is critical to our downtowns, and elevators aren't cheap. Even a 2-stop elevator is probably going to be $250,000. So it is a big chunk of money, but it also depends how much you're putting into the building as a whole. So it's the space that we see more than anything else, because it does take up a good chunk of space, is trying to figure out how to make that work.
So overall, it might be a situation where much larger apartments you don't think you're going to rent, but they could be cheaper in the long run if you're not putting a $250,000 elevator in.
Right. So, and it's hard. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something you have to very carefully weigh. Just how many units can you get on those upper floors? There's another building we worked on in Newark, and it only fortunately had 3 apartments because that one does not have an elevator that serves those upper floors. And for some of these smaller buildings, that may be the solution, is it just doesn't have as many apartments on the upper floors. It's a very delicate balancing act between your pro forma and what is called for by the Fair Housing Act and the OBC and the ANSI and ADA.
Okay. Everyone, write your questions in. Like I said, a lot of times they don't start writing the questions until I'm ready to wrap up. So I want to give people enough space. It's a little bit more complicated topic.
So Frank had one. Let's see.
In an elevator installation was the only component of the tax credit project. If an elevator installation was the only component of a tax credit project, would it be approved, even if no other work was done on the building, as long as the amount spent met the adjusted basis requirement?
So is that's more of a tax credit question, I guess. I guess, well, if it's a historic tax credit project, you have to be renovating the majority of a building, and I wouldn't think only installing an elevator would be considered renovating the majority of a building. So my guess is no, it wouldn't qualify as a tax credit project.
But we'll save that question for Mary Angela on.
Yeah, I
Thursday,
think
maybe.
that's probably a Mary Angela question if she's on.
Again, it'll come back down to costs and things like that.
Yeah.
Since we have a little bit of time, maybe you could give us an anecdote about some solutions that you've found to some of these peculiar things. Here, I do have a question. Let me get this answered first.
Yeah.
It would meet the federal tax credit requirements, and it would meet the state if it were a small building.
Or small building.
Is Elizabeth shared. So going back to maybe some anecdotes of some really challenging projects and what the solution was might be nice to share.
Sure. So one of the projects we worked on a few years ago, or more than a few years ago now, the old Carlisle building in downtown Chillicothe. That's one where it had been a variety of uses over the years. Originally, it was first floor retail. This is kind of your quintessential Main Street building where it's retail on the first floor and several upper floors. Originally, they were offices, including a photography studio. We were renovating it so. Well, we went through several different versions of it, but the final plan for the upper floors was that it would become apartments. And in that case, we were able to find a place to put an elevator in. Now, if you're at all familiar with Carlisle, it actually looks like a bigger building than it is because it had a very early addition done to it that's actually called the Housen building. That is a smaller building that if we were to put an elevator in, it would destroy a good part of that building because it's just not as big, including this really cool ballroom on the top floor. But since it was kind of built as an addition, what we were able to do is, and the floors aligned, it was designed so that elevator can serve both Carlisle and Housen. So you're doing two buildings for the price of one elevator, which is great. So if an owner is starting to buy up Main Street properties, and if you can get two that are next to each other, one thing you might be able to think about doing, even if the floors don't align, is putting in what's called a front and rear opening, or sometimes referred to as a skip stop elevator. So you could put it up against the party wall and access two different sets of floor heights all the way up the building. So right now we're working on a brewery in downtown Columbus that every portion of it has a different set of floor heights. So we have, I think right now, 4 or 5 elevators, and I think all of them are front and rear opening because there are so many floor levels that we have to deal with. And it's just a matter of trying to put everything in so it meets that. So.
Okay, we have another question. What are your favorite resources to be sure that the requirements are met for all 4 sets of regulations about which you spoke? Is there one definitive resource?
I think the ANSI A117 is probably the best one, if at least in Ohio, because that's the one, especially if we're talking about housing, that really drives everything. Now, it's not going to tell you again how many units you need, but that's the one that really defines exactly what it is in a type A, one is in a type B, and tends to be a little more strict than even ADA. ADA really isn't in the building code in Ohio, which it's funny whenever even in our firm, we talk about accessibility, everybody just says ADA, 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 and it's not the case. That ADA isn't really the one that's driving the building code. Now, if you get sued over it, it's probably because of you're not meeting ADA, because it's more of, it belongs to the judicial department of the federal government. So I would say definitely A1 17.1. If you want to be ahead of the ball game, start switching to version 2017. So unfortunately, I think it's not too bad. It's like $35 for the PDF, so it's not horrible. If you're used to buying building codes, that's one of the less expensive ones.
Okay, do we have any other questions coming in? Particularly the people, oh, here. Right. I want to remind people tonight we have a happy hour at 5 o'clock, creative uses for public spaces, which is going to be a lot of fun. All of the happy hours have been fun. If you haven't joined one yet, that's sponsored by the Ohio Arts Council. Tomorrow we have in the morning at 10 a.m. Jason Duff from Small Nation will be speaking about how you combat community naysayers, which we all have. And in the afternoon, we have Bob Nagan from WhizBang, which will be doing a special on marketing your retail store in this crazy new world, which will be a lot of fun. In the afternoon, happy hour is Cool is Everywhere. Photographer Michael Arnaud will be joining us to talk about his publication, and we'll have door prizes of, in addition to Frank's daily beer thing. I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in. Remember that if you need AIA credits, you need to write office manager at heritageohio.org, and Devin can take care of you if he has your membership number. And then that's it. Thank you so much, Melinda. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to Schooley Caldwell for being our day sponsor today.
Thanks, Joyce. It was great to join you guys, even if it's virtual this year.
We'll see you again, maybe at happy hour. Bye.
Hopefully. Bye.